Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Transmedia Arts Seminar. My name is Magda Romanska, and I co-host the seminar with my colleague Ramona Moss. Today, we are welcoming Lisa May Thomas, who is a dancer and researcher at the University of Bristol. Her research focuses on the performance and VR, so we're very much looking forward to Lisa explaining to us how complex and difficult those transitions between VR and real reality is. Welcome, everyone. Our seminar is co-sponsored by Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard and MetaLab at Harvard. We are thankful to both institutions for sponsoring our series. All right, Lisa, I'm gonna pass it on to you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks Magda and Ramona for inviting me. I'm just going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay, is that good? Right. Okay, so thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm going to share with you a project I've been working on for some time, probably since around 2016, 2017. The project is called Soma. I'm going to share some of the project kind of core concepts, and I'm going to detail some of the creative practices that were used in developing and testing Soma with audiences. And I'm also going to discuss some of the applications of this project as part of the work I'm doing now at the Centre for Socio-Digital Futures at the University of Bristol. And in doing this, I'm going to unpack some of the claims made on bodies and perspectives with VR, the development of social VR, thinking about what constitutes caring practices and caring futures, and discuss how projects such as Soma might intervene in some of these claims and the future narratives and corporate imaginaries of the big tech companies. So that's a bit of a roadmap for what I'll be talking about. I'm going to flip on to the next slide. So Soma is an hour-long participatory multisensory experience, and it draws on a dance-based approach to VR technology. So it's location-based. That means all the participants are in the same physical space, but it's also social, kind of collective experience, and it involves participation through movement, and there's an interactive VR component in it. The project was originally conceived and developed from an investigation into my own experience with VR technology, specifically the sort of tension or sort of discomfort I felt when I put the headset on, probably for the first time back in 2016. And since then, I've spent quite a lot of time in VR and watching other people in VR to investigate further this sort of sensory experience, to try and sort of unpack what is going on for different people and how it might be different for different people. I ran a series of workshops with different groups, including with other dance somatic practitioners, with scientists, with general public groups in different contexts, in science centres, art galleries, community spaces, etc. And I also spent quite a lot of time in the studio exploring movement, touch, interaction in VR through kind of improvised play with other dancers and creative technologists. And we developed an early prototype of Soma in 2019. And this was hosted at the University of Bristol for about 30 people. And that formed part of my early PhD research. And after some really interesting and rich participant feedback from the people that experienced it, I decided to sort of develop the prototype into a full-length participatory experience that could be offered to different groups or audiences. So I went for Arts Council funding and was successful in that. And we also moved technological systems. We started using the Vive Pro, which was a tethered system. And we shifted also technical collaborators and started using the Oculus Quest VR technology, which was much lighter and kind of more flexible for our kind of needs at the time. So the Soma project began, And after some time developing and testing ideas with different groups, which I'll go on to discuss later in this talk, we launched a 3-day performance run, and that was hosted by the Bloomsbury Theatre in London in May 2022. And we ran 12 performances of Soma over the 3 days, and around 100 people experienced it. So just to begin, I want to give you a sense of what the project is about. As I said, the key concepts, and also describe the outline of the journey itself. Before that, though, it's important to say that Soma was and is a collaborative and interdisciplinary project, and there have been many people involved in its development along the way. Some of these people you can see here, they are dancers, producers, VR creative technologists, sound technologists, researchers, photographers, cinematographers, the list goes on. But their names will be mentioned at the end of my slides alongside the funders and the supporters of the project. So at the very heart of Soma is an improvised moving and sensory play with different kinds of elastic strings. And these are both physical and virtual strings. And they offer a way to connect bodies in physical and virtual environments, but also across physical and virtual environments. So why strings? In my early play with VR, I began to work with different kinds of human and non-human materialities as sort of unseen forms and surfaces to connect with and move with whilst I was in a VR headset. So they were kind of sticks of different thicknesses and lengths, bendable modeling wire, so you can see some of these in the images, threads, wool, strings, elastic materials, rope, and even earth, as well as the forms and surfaces of other dancing bodies. And through these practices, I found that a kind of touch exchange with another body through practices such as following and leading with the hands and other body parts and weight sharing techniques from contact improvisation took my sensory attention completely into that physical space and away from that kind of visual virtual environment. And this often resulted almost in needing to close my eyes and disengage from that VR space completely to tune into the touch. And exploring contact with the non-human materials didn't take my attention enough. The sort of unseen materiality momentarily caught and then lost in my attention, and the visual domain then sort of took preference. So what began to work with me was something kind of in the middle, and that was to connect to another body or other bodies through different materials whilst in the virtual environment. And I noticed that using different materials to connect bodies through the space created different qualities of movement and ways of interacting and communicating. And these explorations led intuitively towards a collective play with different types of strings, a kind of string play. And the materiality of the strings provided a safe and fluid connection between the bodies, as opposed to the more kind of precarious materials such as the sticks and the wire. And they offered this sort of a more nuanced movement of tension and relaxation. So in developing Soma, we started to work with different kinds of strings, from rope-like strings to finer threads to elastics, and they all differed in their materialities and their kind of movement and sensory affordances, textures, the colours or transparency, and also how they sounded. And we explored, we actually started to explore the specific movements of the strings to create what is known as string figures, or also cat's cradles. And string figures, they appear in cultures all over the world and have done at different periods of time as a traditional storying practice. And Jane Furness writes about string figures, and she writes that all string games begin with an opening, and it's from this opening that a consecutive story follows from movement to movement, or perhaps a touch or a word is associated with a certain turn or twist of the string. And this play led to processes of transposing the string movements from hands to bodies and using the string figures as sort of choreographic frameworks for improvisation. And playing with the idea of relationships between bodies and the string. So, a simple direct relationship when a body within a loop of string or elastic faces another body within that loop, there's that sort of direct connection between them. The relationship is simple. And in that a movement from one of the bodies to another can be kind of transmitted through the string. But as you add more bodies or you add a twist or a turn of the loop, then the relationships get kind of slightly more complicated, more complex, more indirect. Further movements, twists, turns, loops, folds and crosses create more and more complex string formations, and more kind of complex relations emerge between these sort of human and non-human forces at play. So I'm going to share some of these ideas. They're really early ideas in the development of Soma in a short video, which was produced by myself and cinematographer Adam Laity. So I'm going to flip onto the next slide to share that with you now. Okay, I'm just going to stop that there. So dropping threads and failing was key to the practice that was undertaken with strings. In some instances, much time was spent unpicking and unraveling huge knots that had accumulated in seconds with one wrong turn or twist of the body or string. But journeying together with the strings, through these improvised processes brought up new kind of ways for being together and for exchanges between bodies, a kind of tuning practice between the human and the non-human materialities at play. So wide bands of these three meter long loops of elastic, as you can see in the image, were decided on as the best material to work with, as they brought interesting possibilities in terms of the ways in which the movement of bodies could spatially expand and contract, and also offered bodies more possibilities for support in terms of kind of weight giving or leaning into and counterbalancing away from the bands. And the bright colours of the bands kind of cut through the space, offering new frames and dimensions of the sort of surrounding environment, and sort of pulling focus into the spaces between the bodies and extending the kind of perceptual attention of bodies through the strings as the participants sensed each other's movements and stillnesses. So the string play is a tuning practice, the strings tuning a visual but also a physical, tactile sense of connection between the bodies. The sort of sense of touch is extended through the materials. And this sort of idea of touch as an expanded sense, I wanted to share this quote from sociologist Mark Patterson, who writes about touch as a field of flesh that includes the somatic senses, proprioception, the vestibular or balance sense, and kinesthesia in an assemblage that spills out beyond mere skin towards action, expression, and extended sensation. So somatic practices are used often by dancers to tune into and train their senses. And often in these practices, there's a decentering of visual information to bring into the fore of their attention the felt body and environment. These tuning processes increase, as Sheets Johnson writes, the felt and perceptual experiences of our own bodies as corporeal kinetic intentionality, as bodily kinetic experience. For dancers, for instance, dancers close their eyes or wear a blindfold or work with a kind of soft peripheral vision to kind of tune into their bodies this felt sensation and sense of touch to move and navigate with other bodies and in spaces. So when the eyes are open again, there is a more kind of synesthetic play in the senses. And dance scholar Nita Little refers to this as a tactile attention. She writes, when we enhance our visual sense with its synesthetic potentials, sight combines with the tactile properties of our felt embodiment. And Laura Marks, also who writes on haptic visuality in film, and she talks about this need for restoring the flow between the haptic and the optical that our culture is currently lacking. And I think this is in some part due to the development of visual technologies. This dance-based way of sensing is at odds with the way in which VR technology requires you to sense. So I'm going to say a little bit more on this now. So VR is an immersive technology in which participants use a head-mounted display or a VR headset. An immersion in a virtual world or environment can lead to a sense of presence, of being there in that world or environment. And this sense of presence is created by the body's senses, predominantly or dominated by visual information, the visual input coming from the screen inside the VR headset. And that's not just the case for the environment in which the participant is placed in VR, but also for a virtual body or avatar inhabited there. And also can lead, this sense of presence can lead to a sense of embodied agency and interaction there as well in that environment. So how does that work? The screen seen from within the headset generates its simulated properties towards the participant's senses, and the body receives this information and automatically and rapidly reacts, while the cognitive system relatively slowly catches up. The brain is temporarily fooled into the perceptual illusion of being in an alternative world. And this happens through the prioritization of vision and thus some suppression of the non-visual senses. As Mel Slater, who's a leading scholar in VR work, notes, vision alone is often enough to drive the other non-visual senses into the illusion of the virtual reality, as for many people, it is perceptually dominant. So the body reacts and the sensory system rallies to fill in the gaps, whilst the brain, like I said, the cognitive system relatively slowly catches up, and at which point it's too late as the bodily reactions have already occurred. So audio and other kind of haptic and sometimes also smell have been used to encourage a participant further into the virtual domain, engaging with more of their senses. But typically the non-visual kind of sensory information is driven by the visual information inside the headset, and therefore kind of meaningless without this driver, this visual driver. So the technology, the technological affordances of VR kind of leans into this visual dominance of the human sensory system and uses visual input to change the participant's perception of reality. As Jaron Lanier writes, everything about you and your world can change. I quite like this quote. This kind of experience is exemplified here by VR experience maker the UK, and she captures this in her experience of a VR roller coaster ride. She says, I became completely obsessed with the thought that my brain would believe something even when I knew it wasn't true. I kept trying to mediate my physical reaction. All the physical sensations and reactions were already in play. So I was trying to override my brain by saying it's VR. You're not really on a roller coaster. Couldn't do it. My body felt like it was truly free falling. My stomach turned and my head started spinning. So moving on. So the VR headsets act as a sort of blindfold to the world around. And whilst the body is still physically present in that world, the sense of being there temporarily goes away. But in actuality, the body located within a virtual environment is receiving sensory data, if you like, simultaneously from both that visual input from the virtual environment, but also non-visual input from the physical world around. So the visual world in the headset becomes foregrounded. As I said, the physical environment drops away into the background. But there are moments in a VR experience where there can occur sort of mixed sensory messages received by the body from both the physical and the virtual environment, maybe moments in which the visual world within the headset is disrupted. And these moments might bring a conscious awareness to the physical body, its locatedness in the physical environment, the presence of others within that environment, all the features of that environment, and also the materiality and material presence of the technology, the headset, the feel of the headset on the head. And these moments often occur because of issues with the technology, glitch or imperfection in the interface, or they could come from the physical world. You know, if you accidentally bump into something or someone, for instance, or if someone opens a door and then there's a breeze. So little things like that. And in these moments, the brain is sort of confronted with this ambiguous multisensory data. And typically in these situations, the VR kind of experience maker is likely to seek to sort of overcome them as quickly as possible for the smooth running of an experience, to sort of cover up any confusion, so that the participant is sort of fluidly and synchronously experiencing the virtual world. So the Soma VR experience, as I mentioned, was developed from a dance-based mode of engagement, a somatic inquiry with VR, and does bring together these sort of two modes for sensing the world, which are at odds with each other. And it's sort of designed to explore and practice ways of being together as physical and virtual bodies and across physical and virtual spaces. And in doing so, kind of creates a space for the negotiation of these perceptual gaps or sort of sensory misalignments. So I just wanted to share a quote from a participant in Soma, which sort of says a little bit about the experience from the inside. I have a very physical recollection of what it is like, particularly to be guided and touched by people that you can't see. That was a really striking component of that piece. I'm relatively familiar now with seeing other people in VR, and generally that means avoiding walking there. That's usually what that gives you. So to be doing something with them collaboratively is so generous and interesting. But it was the bodies unseen that has stayed with me most. Of all those things about the physical space, I still don't really have a reference for, has struck me as really extraordinary way of feeling. Inevitably, with that kind of thing, every touch is incredibly heightened when I don't have a visual reference, or I can't check it in terms of the audio or the visual, as I'm already engaged in this other space. So to have these two realities playing in real time, how that felt and how much potency and potential that feels like it has for the form, which is so focused often on what the visual and what is the sort of empathy being generated by this picture of a thing that I'm looking at. The attention to the body and acknowledgement of those two spaces coexisting was really quite profound. So I've run Soma with lots of different people and groups in different settings. And after some cancellations due to COVID, we finally hosted the performances, as I mentioned, at the Bloomsbury Theatre in London. And through that, 12 groups of 8 participants were led by a team of dancers. And in each group of 8, 4 of the participants went into VR and 4 of them acted as witnesses, experiencing Soma from the outside. I'm going to say a little bit more on that later. I just want to walk you through the piece using a few images, and to say also that Soma operates across sort of 3 phases of activity. There's a kind of pre-VR, could be sort of called onboarding phase, and then the phase in which VR is being used, and then this kind of after space of VR, the sort of offboarding. So a physical string play constitutes the first phase of the Soma journey, as I've spoken about, using 2 different physical strings, the wide yellow elastic band that we saw pictures of earlier, and there's an image here as well, and then a thinner transparent elastic string. And the strings are used as a tuning device, so to enable that kind of physical, tangible sense of connection between the bodies of the dancers and participants, to enable them to kind of orientate as a group, to explore moving together, communicating non-verbally, using the strings. Then the thinner string is introduced, and this sort of offers quite a different materiality. It's lighter, less elastic, sort of almost transparent, and has sonic properties. And this offers a different mode of embodied play. It's more intimate, using more delicate gestures, so using fingers and thumbs to pluck the string and sound the string. Sounds like a bit like a bass guitar as you pluck it. The dancers then use this string as a mechanism to group the participants together inside the string, and they take the participants then into a kind of eyes closed walk, and this moves the participants physically into the space in which the VR technology is set up. And in the walk, there's a kind of tuning into the non-visual sensory information from the physical environment around, the touch and the movement of the string, and the sense of building connection and maybe trust in the group and between the participants and the dancers. So the second phase is in VR, and as I mentioned, some of the participants enter into VR and others remain outside. And the witnesses are invited to explore the world of VR through entering into dialogue and play with those that are in VR in the headsets. And in the Soma VR, there are different visual states. There are 2 virtual strings that are sonified, so they make sound as you move them, a bit like, and then the strings are sort of similar to the ones that participants engage with in the physical space. So the world is quite expansive. There's a kind of quite a morphy floor, which sort of moves slightly, and then a kind of big sky separated by a horizon. So the first sort of string comes in from the edges of the world, and it sort of hangs in the air. At this point, participants are handed controllers, which represent their hands to interact with the string. And like I said, the string is sonified, which gives auditory access to the play. And this also acts as a bridge into the virtual world for the witnesses. And in the middle of this VR section, all of the participants are invited to close their eyes and to resense into their bodies, disconnecting for a moment from the visuality of the experience. And their controllers are then taken from them. And as they open their eyes, the thick string, as you can see in this image here, has been replaced by a thinner string. And they can interact with this one using hand tracker technology, using their fingers and thumbs to pluck the string as they had done with the physical string earlier. And their hands are represented with small dots, kind of giving an outline of their joints. And so in these moments of interaction with these 2 virtual strings, the participants are invited to give the VR participants are invited to give their controllers or their hands to the witnesses and to guide them to interact in the virtual environment which they cannot see. This assembling of bodies across physical and virtual environments. So before they transition out of the VR section, the string disappears into the distance and their hands change into small dots of light that connect together like a web of constellations. And this makes a crackling sound as they move. They leave trails of these constellations that slowly disappear. And the witnesses, again, can also interact here by tricking the headsets into picking up their hands instead and playing with and creating visual and auditory worlds for those in the headsets. So after VR, this sort of final phase, it's a space where participants are invited to remember and reflect on what has happened and sort of takes place in semi-darkness. The VR participants are asked to close their eyes as the lights dim and the headsets are taken off. And as the light slowly emerges, a very light silver thread is placed in their hands, making gradually visible the sort of interconnections between their bodies in the space. A bit like the final state in the VR world that I spoke about. And there are also 5 mini speakers in the space, each of which contain an element of the Soma sound environment, and they're also placed into the space and played with, moved and sounded by the participants and dancers. So this sort of post-VR environment space kind of supports the continuation of any sensory shifts that might have taken place and offers that kind of space and time to explore, imagine and remember together, and the kind of space-time of a sort of recalibration of the senses and to one another, and the space around them, sort of gradual return to the visual world for everyone. I want to speak in a bit more detail though now about two key aspects of the development of Soma for the Bloomsbury Theatre. Firstly, as a journey through which the participants are guided by the dancers through kind of physical, touch and verbal prompts, invitations, but also challenges, the ways in which we thought about and practiced care and what that meant to us for the dancers to guide the participants through the piece. How might they care, but also kind of feel cared for in this process. So the participants are invited to enter into an intimate connection with their own bodies and each other, and the human and the non-human, physical and virtual bodies, environments around them. And just sharing this quote from Fisher and Tronto on care, they just write, on the most general level, we suggest that caring be viewed as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. The relationships between the dancers and participants drew from a thinking around a kind of care which does not kind of prioritize one body or one sense over another. It's not about one person leading whilst the other follows, but a practice of assembling and sharing perception as a kind of expansion of sensing beyond what is directly available to the body by accessing the environment through the body and the senses of another. And I also want to share a quote from Puig de la Bella Casa, who writes, situations of care imply non-symmetrical, multilateral, asymmetrical, asubjective obligations that are distributed across more than human materialities and existences. Secondly, and as a result of some quite remarkable feedback from the early prototype of Soma from a visually impaired dancer, Holly Thomas, we became really interested in how other visually impaired people might experience the piece. So back in 2019, Holly's experience was quite profound, as I said. She spoke about when she went into the very first iteration of this project, and that she probably wouldn't be able to access the VR environment that well because of being visually impaired. And so she wasn't really sure how much she would be able to see in that environment. And she was really surprised because what actually happened was that she could see the environment really well, really clear, and the VR world became very three-dimensional. And it's important to say that in the real world, she doesn't have much depth perception at all. So everything appears really quite flat. So going into that environment for her was almost like kind of hyper 3D. And she had this very physical kind of response in her sort of physical sensation in her body to that experience, that visual stimulus, and being in this very three-dimensional environment. And she felt very kind of physically connected to the Soma world. And she says, the Soma experience is really about taking a journey where I could drop into my body and really engage with all of the senses, including having a felt response through my visual perception. Yet despite this visceral encounter with 3D, Holly notes that VR cannot simply be recommended to visually impaired communities without reflection, unless you're actually working with people who might experience VR in different ways. How do you know what it is that you need to create? And the more people that can be involved in that process from the VI community, people who are visually impaired, but also more broadly the disability community, then I think the richer the outcome of what you create and the more inclusive and accessible that will be. So as VR's promise of transportation to other realities seems to mainly depend on the participants' eyes, requiring a sensory system which is visually dominant, we were interested in exploring how VR might be experienced by someone with reduced sight or even no sight at all, and what their experience might offer to those of us who are working with sight. So we ran developing the Bloomsbury Theatre performances, we ran some workshop sessions with two groups of visually impaired people. So you can see some images here of the workshops, working with Holly and also a PhD researcher at UCL called Harsha, who's also visually impaired. And during the workshops, Holly joined the participants in VR, and she improvised this very vivid audio description of what she could see. And this not only brought the visually impaired participants into that virtual world, but it brought everyone else who was not in a VR headset into that world as well. And that was really quite an amazing experience. And as a result of that, we developed this an audio descriptive layer throughout the Soma journey, and we developed a witness role, as I've spoken about. So in terms of the audio description, so unlike conventional audio description, which provides kind of pre-curated information to visually impaired audiences alone, descriptions in Soma resemble kind of integrated audio descriptions. So they're heard by all of the participants. So receiving, engaging with the descriptions is sort of part of the experience for everybody, but also to say that the audio description is co-created and shapes the experience by the participants themselves and the dancers, as they each are verbalizing what they're perceiving and how. And also, like I say, we developed the witness role, so participants that experience the piece without a headset, accompanying those entering into VR and accessing the virtual world via the audio description and the other sort of sonic and physical layers of the piece. So just to briefly mention these other sonic layers, this is the spatialized sonified virtual string. So as you can see, it's like a kind of mesh, and the string is the kind of green circle within the mesh. And so as participants move the string in that virtual environment, they sort of perturb the mesh, and that produces the sound. There's also these portable speakers that I mentioned as well, which were part of that final kind of after space of VR. We also tested these in the workshops with visually impaired people who had great fun just moving them around, creating sounds sort of through the space and thinking about that kind of spatial aspect of sound. So I'm going to share some words with you now before I kind of move on to the next kind of part of my talk. And I will invite you, if you want, just to, just going to not change my screen. I'm going to invite you just to maybe step away from your screen. You want to close your eyes, just move position a bit. And I'm just going to read you these words. They're written by a mentor of mine called Angus Balbirnie, who's a theatre director, works internationally, and he came into the Soma project quite late on, and he just wrote these words about the experience, and I just thought they're kind of quite poetic, beautiful, and so I want to share them with you. I knew nothing about VR before being asked by Lisa to help mentor the project. I've never gamed in my life, never held two controls and stared at activity on a screen. Now I have. Now I've entered the world, a world inside a headset. I'm inside a plastic container, wrapped over my eyes, in a world generated from across the room, from inside a laptop. I'm wrapped in a deserted world of blue sky, yellow dawn, and shifting floor. I have no body, no relationship to the norms of place or navigation. I focus on my hands and the controllers as they affect this golden band floating around me. I can turn it and twist it and share it with others also in their VR state too. We have a form of exchange and we begin to dance. Something settles in this generated world. Something shifts in how the body senses itself as an activity that somehow responds to both an inner and an outer sense of itself. What would normally be understood as anomic becomes shared. What is very isolating leaks into a shared environment. There is something being shaped here, being danced, being created. It happens in layers, the individual in the VR headset and in a VR world. The dancer who supports and informs them, surrounds them with their attention. The witnesses who watch and attend to both. A kind of satellite of attention, questioning and observing closely. Then there are others at the edges of the space, watching all of this, seeing or not seeing, how the weaving of these various states, attentions and correspondences form and dissolve in moments of order, disorder, dancing, choreography, theatre, science and perceptual exchange. When the VR world is sharing its ribbons, which are moved through space by the collective hands of the participants, a dance emerges, a dance of delicate arms and bodies held inside one space, but translated into kinesthetics for those observing, a dance of inner meaning translated into external space and action, a way to share someone's dreams, to share a world that generates the subjective, opens that out to a shared space, becomes objective, visible and invisible at different times, and then returns to asking how a generated state inside a computer can create a shared condition of bodies being both alone and together in a world we usually only dream or put on stage as an event. Towards the end of the VR journey, those inside the headsets see a growing constellation of generated dots and lines that form dancing webs of atomic structure. They are moved and condensed or opened out by the hands of those involved, and somehow it is a dance that takes us deep into how imaginations can be touched by something that is both seen and unseen, and how dancing is also found in the darkness and in the ways we try to pass our realities to each other. We are dancing ourselves inside out. I'm going to stop there. Okay, so, oh, sorry, not stop there, Ramona. I mean, stop there. I just want to take a moment to unpack some of the claims around VR technologies, the assumptions, implications of using VR, and critically, how these claims are shaping futures, and to raise some key questions. I won't be able to go into much depth, but to share some of the current thinking and concerns. So virtual reality holds the promise of immersing people in virtual worlds. However, the initial work on the relationship between VR and disability, for instance, suggests that VR is a body-centric technology that poses barriers for disabled users. The assumptions being made about bodies inherent in VR have implications when disabled people engage with the technology. And the work by Gerling and Spell in 2021, their findings show that VR is an inherently ableist technology that assumes corporeal standard, an ideal non-disabled human body, and fails to adequately accommodate disabled people. As well as VR making assumptions about bodies, as I've discussed, it relies on a sensory system which is visually dominant. So immersion is based on the visual sense, and this mode of sensing excludes certain users, such as visually impaired people, but it also narrows perceptual experiences, so it limits the use of the other senses or modalities for sensing. And to include users with non-normative sensory standpoints, such as visually impaired participants, access to VR is often based on technical solutions without changing the kind of fundamental approach. VR also has claims on perspective, so it's increasingly used with heavily critiqued claims that constellate around concepts of immersion, presence, and empathy that have been made about virtual reality across many disciplines of research and practice, such as psychology, criminology, immersive journalism, and film, for the potential for VR to enable first-person experiences of other and transformation of self through notions of body ownership and full body illusion, where it is claimed that when a person embodies another in VR, there is a blurring of self and other. Whilst to make our bodies part of the experience of a story is what creates a sort of stronger entry point to engage a deeper emotional response and perhaps connect us empathetically to the events being portrayed, Liam Jarvis writes about the unrealizable promise that we might become the other body through immersive experiences with virtual reality. In 2016, Madre and Metzinger introduced their code of conduct, ethical conduct for VR research, suggesting that VR could potentially manipulate behavior significantly, particularly when illusions of embodiment are misused. And in a world in which data is as a precious commodity, there are other crucial and critical questions about data security and the ethical handling of user-provided information. So we need to think critically about and establish robust ethical guidelines for using these technologies, both in the creation of artistic work as well as the sort of practical applications. There's also been a relatively recent and rapid development of social VR worlds. So social VR platforms have increased in popularity, with many people turning to these platforms to experience social connection, including a rapid influx of users during the COVID-19 pandemic. And these platforms are sort of typically online, like I say, with remote users. And a paper on VR chat, one of the platforms, explores the use of this explicitly as a mental health support tool. So VR mediates behaviours that are not possible in real life, expanding and making more fluid the boundaries of what is deemed socially appropriate or acceptable. And there's sort of lack of best practice or industry standards and contextual cultural insight around those participating. There are ethical issues that arise in these sort of typically unregulated spaces. Catherine Allen and Verity McIntosh has laid out some of these issues in their Safeguarding the Metaverse, a report that they produced 2022. And just thinking about futures, Meta's Horizon World envisage a future in which there is an embodied internet in which we are all connected using multiple sense modalities, where there is agency to even create our own worlds, a future metaverse, the next phase internet, an augmented digital experience that will blur the difference between real and virtual worlds. Some of this sort of language, a space in which we can feel like we are there with other people in a way that we can't feel in our digital experiences today. It's important to kind of critique and intervene in some of these claims on immersive futures. And performance and arts-based practices offer a move away from binary notions of full body illusion, seeking value in the spaces in between the real and the virtual as a site of disruption, such as the work Involution by Lundell and Seattle, as seen in the image, performance-based work which operates in and sort of values the spaces in between as sites of these sort of sites of disruption, exposing, critiquing human-technology relationships. The sort of specific modes of spectatorship enabled by virtual reality uniquely allow us, as Sita Poppet writes, to relocate ourselves as embodied beings, allow us to ask questions about embodiment and humanity through the experiences of our individual bodies in a way that has never been possible before. And Puig de la Balacasa, bringing this quote in again, argues for a sort of revaluing of touch in human encounters with technologies of vision as a way to reclaim these assembled spaces of bodies and technologies which are driven through vision-led modes of encountering the world, through processes of reappropriation of the sensory system towards synesthetic modalities. And she writes about touch as a neglected mode of relating with a compelling potential to restore a gap that keeps knowledge from embracing a full embodied subjectivity. So coming back to Soma, in 2023, we explored and developed a version of Soma without the dancers, so operating as a kind of social VR experience, which is location-based, and the participants are invited to guide each other through the experience. So as we know, there's 8 participants in Soma, they're not all in that visual virtual world at the same time. And in this version, they're sort of switching roles halfway through, and the piece is operating around their dialogue between these spaces. So we've been testing this new version of Soma with students, working with the psychology department at the University of Bath, with colleagues from the University of Bristol at the Centre for Socio-Digital Futures, also the immersive theatre students there. And we've been using this new version of Soma as a practice to move through and think about socio-digital futures. And the notion, the sort of framing of the word socio-digital implies a notion that we live in a socio-digital world, that the social and the digital are interwoven, that no single future awaits us. There are many possible socio-digital futures, and how these futures are imagined, claimed, and acted on in the present opens up some futures and closes down others. And Soma enables us to investigate some of the future claims, possibilities, and imaginaries across this relationship between and interweaving of the social and the digital, and also between the physical and the virtual. So as part of Sense of, so the Centre for Socio-Digital Futures, we've also been thinking about and exploring notions of practices of care in Soma, and the sort of important concepts that we think are possible to explore in this experience, and the roles of caring, being cared for, the embodied sensations of care and how, how that feels in the body, the relationship and exchange between virtual and physical care, and exploring, sort of finding out more about negotiating this physical digital relationship. So just to finish, I'm going to play a short video. I don't think there's any sound, but it's just a very little quick video. You can see some of the sort of inside world of Soma, just to end. Okay, I'm just pinging up my thank you slides. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was wonderful. Very illuminating presentation. Let's see if we have any questions from our audience.
Well, maybe as you guys are thinking about your questions, and obviously you can at any point kind of unmute yourself or raise your hand either virtually or physically, and to join the conversation. But I first of all would like to thank you, Lisa. It's really wonderful to have you here and to have you do this talk, especially since, I saw little bits of Soma and heard about it when you were still doing it as a PhD project and was still kind of in the more nascent stage and starting off. So this is really fascinating and wonderful. Thank you so much. And I guess my first question is the thing that always fascinated me about Soma. And I love in how far, you are now kind of creating this much bigger arch towards like what the status of VR and social VR is more generally culturally, and also specifically the question of care. But maybe to start off with Soma itself, what always really interested me was this onboarding and offboarding space, right? And in how much that already sort of marks a critique of the idea of the seamlessness of VR, imagine, right? That it isn't as instantaneous and seamless, maybe, or there's more complicated negotiations that are going on. And it's so wonderful how you're teasing those out kind of through different forms of materiality. But I was just wondering how did you get to that stage of realizing that you needed that onboarding and offboarding space? And was that always clear to you in a way, or how did the experimentation with the participants work to kind of bring you to this phase of really kind of needing a perceptual sort of adaptation period on either side in a way?
I mean, it's always never been just about the VR. And I think, you know, in the piece, each of those phases, if you like, the kind of pre-VR onboarding and then the VR and the offboard, they're all kind of equal in a way. It's not like, you know, a small piece of something and then the main bit is the VR section. It was always about all of it being part of the experience in kind of equal weighting. And I mean, I just experienced quite a lot of VR being done where people kind of are plunged into VR headsets from nothing. And that kind of real sense of slight disorientation and then just kind of loss of the body or loss of the space. So, you know, for example, I remember someone being in VR in a kind of art, I think it was an art gallery context, and they kind of went to reach for something and they were like, oh, I can't reach it. And they'd sort of forgotten that they had legs and they could move towards it or bend their knees or bend, you know, so they just kind of forgot they had a body. And I guess it was that I was sort of interested in, or how do we give people the kind of tools to have some flexibility in that space to attend across the kind of physical, virtual. And it's not obviously binary like that, but just kind of giving them some kind of tuning skills, that kind of priming before kind of then going into that immersive visual environment. So something around that, Ramona, felt quite important to do. And for me personally, when I you know, as I was saying, I sort of struggled with VR quite a lot when I first went into VR, and I sort of trying to understand what that was, and felt very alone often in VR and very kind of disconnected. And touch was something really I felt really important, to kind of feel the ground, to feel something, and that's where all the kind of exploration with the sort of different materials came from. Was that kind of need for something, for kind of an anchoring somehow whilst I was in that space.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think what's really interesting also, the other thing is that in a way, as much as VR sort of claims a certain three-dimensionality, but that's all sort of in the headset in a way, you are creating a three-dimensionality that's sort of necessary to, yeah, to understand it as a performance as well, right? Because it's equally interested to witness it or to have all these other roles that are part of Soma, which I think makes it really yeah, that's to me like one of the really great benefits of the project. So I was also wondering about the role of care, obviously. That's I think both very important, and maybe and I thought the critique that you're pointing there about the sort of inherent ableism of VR is really interesting, because it runs counter so many of the sort of utopian discourses that there are about, like, well, obviously VR is the empathy machine, but also VR is a tool in medical practice, etc., with patients to sort of model how their limbs may work when they're not working anymore or whatever. So I was just wondering whether you could speak a little bit more about that, and how yeah, how these two argumentations sit side by side, or again, you know, in conflict with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, I mean, obviously VR is used in incredible ways, you know, in really, really useful ways. And it's not to sort of discount that. And sometimes the sort of this prioritization of vision is useful to us in certain contexts. So it's very, you know, it's very different depending on how you're thinking about it and using it. But in terms of care, when I guess it was coming again out of sort of a dance practice and a sense of assembling, a sense of how we assemble with another body or with a space, and how we can kind of almost become that body. So I'm thinking about contact improvisation, for instance, you know, when you're weight sharing, you know, and you lose the floor, but you find it through another body, or, you know, the body that's sort of holding you is finding kind of reach through your arm, and that sort of assembling and that idea of you know, your own boundaries, if you like, kind of encompassing other, and that kind of for me is kind of like about this sense of care that just sort of isn't prioritizing one way of perceiving over another, one reality over another. It's a sort of a distributed sense of knowing the world. Don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of where I was. Yeah.
Sorry, no, go ahead. I didn't mean to jump in.
That's okay.
I have another question. You mentioned that there was this moment of misalignment where the VR reality went against the physical reality, and that, you know, sort of what happens in the brain when this moments of misalignment happen. Can you speak a little bit more about it? Like, you know what I mean? Like the sensual clash of different perceptions, of different sensory, you know, inputs.
Yeah,
because that's fascinating. I mean, we've been doing this in, you know, in post-dramatic theater, all of those acoustic sounds and trying to disconnect each element of, you know, of sensual experience as much as possible. And I'm wondering, you know, what's your experiences with it, like in in VR, like how does it translate from what the post-dramatic theater experiments, how do they translate into this environment where those things, that's all of those sensory things are out of joint in some way?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And it's kind of kind of can be quite jarring. This kind of moment where you might be immersed in this kind of visual environment and then something kind of happens that doesn't match that. So whether you kind of might reach out to touch something you can see, and then you kind of maybe hit something else that isn't that, and there's this jarring, and you're trying to make sense of this sort of conflicting information. And so I find that really, really fascinating, that kind of space of confusion, and how you kind of resolve that, whether you have it consciously are kind of deciding, do you know what, I'm going to forget about that, I'm going to go with the visual, or whether you can't, you know, what's that kind of process, and whether that's even a kind of conscious process in that moment. And I'm actually working on a project at the moment at the Bristol Digital Futures Institute, where we've mapped this this physical set to it's sort of mapped to a virtual environment. So they're aligned, and we're just playing with messing around with that in little bits. So I was like, how can we kind of play around with this misalignment? You know, the seams, I quite like that idea of the seams, this idea of something being seamless, and like, well, what about the seams? I quite like the seams. Let's play with that space of tension. So even like things like the little the windows, a triangle on the world, the physical world. What if we made them a different shape? How would that be? Like, what would win out over the other? Or would you just kind of agree that there's two options available simultaneously, and that's sort of okay, that they're not the same? So those sort of questions I'm really, really fascinated by, and what sort of also kind of what happens in the body in those moments. Like, you know, what are the kind of almost physiological effects as well? Because I think we also have those moments in sort of real life too, and how we navigate that, and maybe again, is that a kind of conscious thing or not? So I think it's a really fascinating kind of piece.
I think,
hello. Yeah.
Annette and Kate would like to ask a question, I think. And Annette, I think you were first.
Well, actually, that idea of you know, the mismatch is something that gaming VR is using. They're actually bringing in the idea of using latency, the hiccup, in digital technology as a re-embodying tool, so that you're in VR and you're having this gaming experience, you're disembodied. But to make it more real, they'll have a moment of latency just to throw you out of VR, to re-embody you, to make it, that immersive world, feel even more real. But actually it's a very you're oscillating in between the real and the unreal, so you're being thrown backwards and forwards, and you end up in this kind of in between space, a metaphysical multiplicity. You become a multiplicity, you know. And it reminded me of what you were talking about earlier about the flesh, you know, and the whole idea that the flesh becomes transparent and the body just becomes, I think it was Donna Haraway was talking about continually emergent, dispersed, and evolving within the space. So the flesh almost becomes another sense, in the same sense of vision. But they're using the latency, that specific, and it's almost like going back to using an analog technique within a digital world to make VR more immersive. This is really real world. Yeah, very, very exciting. I really, and that's through gaming is brilliant in terms of innovation when they go off, I think, because they spend so much time in it. Yeah, brilliant talk.
Yeah, I mean, and I was thinking, how long can you sustain you know, I mean, I'm sure there's been studies, but like, how long do you sort of sustain that sense of immersion before that's sort of broken in some way, and when the brain, maybe the cognitive system, does sort of catch up, persuade you that you're not really there. But yeah, no, thanks, Annette, and nice to see you.
Thank you.
Kate, did you have a question too?
Hi. Yes. Hi, Lisa. I'm sorry I
Hi.
missed the beginning. I'm interested in speed. And I'm interested specifically, I feel like we have this association that practices of care go to slowness. They go to stopping, they go to slow scholarship, they go to reflection, they go, and in the same way, like I feel like visually, speed doesn't work well in digital spaces. Your eyes can't track it, but there's a clarity sometimes for the body. Like bodies can access speed maybe in a way that visually doesn't go. And so I'm really interested, maybe if you can speak a little bit to care and speed.
Care and speed. I mean, you know, vision is really slow, and you know, that kind of leaving it into sort of all leaving reactions into that, putting reactions into that visual space is really feels really slow. And you know, when I think about, for instance, improvising, and I think about sort of tuning out of that visual space, I can move much faster. I can be, my responses can be much faster. So I'm thinking as sensorially, speed is interesting. And yeah, I mean, just thinking about that and thinking about the quality of my response, even though it's quicker, is deeper. And I wonder if that also speaks to care. That sense of like full-bodied response that comes from somewhere deeper, but it's actually faster. So I agree, it's not that care has to be slow is not that, you know, somatic practices have to just be lying on the floor and doing really slow things. Actually accessing the body in communication, somatic communication, could actually, things could move faster. Conversations, non-verbal, could move faster between bodies in that space, but incorporate a sense of this, what sort of distributed sense of body-like care. Don't know if that really answers, I don't know if that answers your question, Kate, but it's a really interesting one, thinking about that sort of temporal aspect of sensory engagement, and actually thinking about also this, you know, you see the kind of high production kind of Netflix films and TV content, and it's really fast. It's just it's really like quickly edited, and it's almost like that for me feels like a different kind of speed, a different kind of like noise almost, that's just coming at me really quick. It has like, doesn't have care, doesn't have that kind of deep something deep connectedness. It feels more glossy or kind of superficial. Yeah, I don't know. There's some thoughts there.
Debbie, did you have a question as well?
Thank you, Lisa. Just a really amazing presentation. My mind is really spinning along here. I am a dancer and researcher. So the idea of improvisation and the body, and I've never had any experience with VR. So keep that in mind as I try to express what I wish to ask you. When I think of improvisation with dancers in a studio, what sometimes occurs is that you, in weight taking or in contact with others and their need for your support, there's oftentimes where you let go of recognition about your own bodily movement. And you are more in the space of recognizing their movement and your assistance within it. So when I'm looking at this in that last example, video example you showed us, and you see the ribbon moving in the VR, and they're manipulating that with hand motion, right? Because they're holding those devices. And yes, they are on their knees or standing and moving and altering the shapes of their bodies. But ultimately, it's where their hands are. It's not where their buttocks or their left knee is that is altering the ribbon. When I think of that, I'm wondering, well, is this like being in that scenario with that other dancer in a real space, in a life space on Earth with that other dancer, where you do lose a sense of your own body? And what I mean is, does it suddenly become, do you suddenly become focused, even though you are moving and it appears to a witness that you are dancing? You see your body moving, swirling, your hips moving, your knees, your feet articulating with your hand motion, but really your hand motion moving the ribbon. Do you, as the dancer doing that, just become the ribbon and then lose your body really as a secondary aspect? That's what
Mhm.
I'm wondering.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I mean, I think people probably experience it differently. I think, you know, done workshops with quite a lot of dance folk using VR, and there's been real differences in that experience. You know, so some dancers I've worked with really have their body, they don't lose their body in that space, and others they do. And it's really, you know, it's really interesting. And you know, as dancers, we often work with our eyes closed, so we don't often need visual information about our bodies. There's something about having our eyes open and seeing something else changes that for some people. Whether that's something to do with their sort of visual imagination, whether they need that visual space that's been taken up by something to kind of access their kind of unseen body. But I mean, I think, you know, there's sort of, it's really interesting. And I think also that's why touch, I think, is really interesting in VR, particularly when you don't necessarily see your body. There's a kind of reassuring sense of feeling another body, even if you can't see it in that space. And the little video you saw at the end, that was a little kind of duet I created. It's not the kind of, I mean, it uses the Soma world, but it's two dancers in that. But there's this, I guess it brings up this sort of presence and absence, constant kind of shift between presence and absence. And I was going to say something else and I've forgotten what that is now. It will come back to me maybe. But I mean, the felt, oh, that was it. It was about the hands. So, you know, if VR technology was designed by dancers, it wouldn't just be the hands that would be tracked or the head that would be tracked, you know, it would be the body, you know, the body would be incorporated. And a lot of visual tech is just this loop between, you know, or gaming, you know, between the eyes and the hands. And that's just that mini little loop that forgets the larger loop of the felt body and the ground and, you know, all those other things. So, you know, it's really hard to kind of get away from that because that's just how the technology is designed. It just, you know, the cameras in the headsets see, they understand what hands are, so they can kind of understand that there's your hands and they're moving in space. The constellations that we're playing with at the end of Soma means that the dots sort of fall out of your hands. So they kind of, you can kind of then, you know, if you traced your body with your hands, you would be able to sort of create your body with the constellations in a way. So you can kind of play around with that. But even like if your hands go out of your eyesight, then, you know, you don't, it doesn't see them because you're not looking at them. And so thinking about things like the backspace, you know, in contact, thinking about the backspace, the backspace is not seen by the headset, therefore kind of does not exist for that headset. So there's sort of things like that that you think, yeah, this was definitely not designed by a dancer. But that, you know, that's where you have to get creative with it and explore. So actually what's really interesting in Soma is when you get people to, the person in VR sort of hides their hands and then their kind of partner will offer their hands as the hands, and the headset doesn't know that it's someone else's hands. It just thinks, oh yeah, it's the participant's hands, and you can kind of play with that bridging, you know, even though the person that is the hands and is seen in that virtual space cannot see them because they are not in a headset. So it's quite a really interesting space to kind of play in, where you're really having to assemble perceptually to kind of get a kind of, yeah, to get a sense of what's happening for each other.
Lisa, I wanted to get back quickly to the space in Soma once, like that sort of horizon, etc., etc. And And I also wanted to kind of tell you, I'm still wondering about speed, Kate. So
Yeah, I am as well.
Because, you know, in a way, because the space is so empty and sort of like you're kind of like denying the visual space in a way through that, you know, through that sort of beautiful blandness that's there in a way. And that obviously allows you then to do a lot more with touch with them. I mean, was that kind of the logic behind it, or was there something else? And I'm interested because there are a couple of VR performances that I've seen that also have that sort of horizon and walking into that sort of like potentiality of empty space, but that also play a lot with question of sort of you know, the potential of sort of totally remaking the body and of kind of creating an alternate reality, obviously there. So I was kind of wondering how, yeah, why you conceived the space as it was, and in terms of the question of speed, there's this Scottish VR maker, Kate, and she's trying to kind of queer VR, and what she's really working on is to sort of create these you know these environments where you by default will not be able, because a lot of VR is so guided that, you know, despite the fact that there is a lot there that you can maybe see, you always know where you're supposed to be looking, right? And then there's a certain progression. But there, the question of speed, I think, comes in interesting ways, because there's always a sense that you will miss something, and that there are all these experiences that are being, you know, that are simultaneous in a way. And so therefore, it sort of frees your sense of perception, because you are the one then in the VR that is not just sort of led along a particular path, which can be extremely frustrating, but rather that you choose the sort of perceptual story that you make. Maybe that speaks a little bit to speed, but I'm wondering. So, but I was just wondering whether you could talk a little bit more again, Lisa, about why you created the space inside the VR the way it was, or whether that wasn't actually that important for you.
Yeah, it was important. I was thinking about speed as well, and I was thinking of what you're saying, Ramona, about the sort of spoon-fed or not, or just that sense of, you know, you're not going on your own journey. Someone is like designed a journey that you're then kind of taking. There's do this, do that, press this. I've been in VR environments where you're just one thing after another, and you're not fully kind of inhabiting that space. You're constantly being cued to be interacting in certain ways. And I think Soma is basically the opposite of that. So I just wanted to create a space that felt like it felt expansive, so that you felt like you wanted to move in that space. I wanted to create a floor that you know, you'd want to go and see what it was, because it kind of moves a bit. So maybe you wanted to go down to the floor and have a look at that. So it kind of, you know, and then a sense of horizon, so sense of, yeah, spaciousness. I also played around with taking off. There's a guardian thing, a safety feature in VR headsets, where you give the headset your play area, and then if you go outside of that, the big horrible grid kind of comes up, and it's quite sort of, this can be quite disruptive. So we managed to sort of turn those off, which obviously is a safety feature, but because we had always people guiding and kind of, you know, being there to support, we overrided that safety feature. Although now you can't turn them off in the Quest 2s, but we haven't found a way of doing that yet. But so there's this sense then of just being able to not be kind of in a grid or in a defined space. And we worked also with visually impaired people to think about colour as well. And so the blue and the yellow against the blue was quite striking, and easier to kind of navigate and see in that space for the people that we worked with. And I'm aware that, you know, all visual impairments are all quite different, but we just worked with a handful of people just to explore that. And yeah, but also to say I did set up so many really big space once, and I did walk to the end of the space, and I didn't really like it very much. It was quite scary, so yeah, that was weird. It was just like a kind of big void at the end. So even though it's this, so that was sort of surprising to me, that something about that world, I found out something about that world that yeah, through the ability to do that in a big space. And my creative technologist I was working with did the same, and also didn't like it either. So it certainly won't be incorporating. But yeah, I mean, it was we, you know, as a group of dancers as well, just moving and playing around with texture and color, and also like having limited time, so not having low, you know, just having to kind of have a ground and a sky, but that actually, what else did we need? We had the strings, created a space to move in, so that other, yeah, didn't feel like I needed other visual noise in that space.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. I mean, we did this is a super small excursion, but we did a piece that was dancing in VR as well, which had two dancers, and we used kind of different pre-existing apps that they would then use, and one of them would dance outside VR, one inside VR, and it was kind of, and there were different ways of how they would handle the controllers, etc., etc. But the interesting thing was that for the dancers, but also in general, the app actually running a game, for example, like a shooter game, was actually not very, you know, it became too much. And so it was like, in the end, we just waited until the game, we were on the game over screen, and then we just did it on that. And so in a way that we're, you know, we used all the features to their, you know, just tiny bits of them, because otherwise it just became too overwhelming in terms of the sensual experience inside. Yeah. And the movement and the kind of, you know, physical score they could develop was a lot freer when there wasn't so much input in a way. So I get where that's coming from. Is there any final question? Otherwise, we would close it here, I think. And thank you very much, Lisa, and thank everybody for joining from lots of different places.
Thank you everyone for coming along.
Yes, and special thanks again to Mahindra Humanities Center and Metal Lab at Harvard for hosting us. And we invite everyone to join us in the future seminars. You're welcome to visit either Metal Lab website or Mahindra Humanities website, and you'll find our seminars there. And we also invite you to watch some of the previous lectures from previous years, which are posted on the Mahindra Humanities website. Thank you so much, Lisa. We appreciate this wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us.